So good morning to the attendants of the annual conference of the Rubinstein Center. I'm Dr. Rועי of the Shטריקס Law School from the College of Management, and to discuss the future of Israel and its democracy, I'm joined today by Professor Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz needs no introduction. As everybody in the room knows, he's a renowned professor of constitutional and criminal law from Harvard University, and an avid supporter of Israel along the years, which also at times voiced his criticism of its government when he felt warranted. So on that point, Professor Dershowitz, 20 years ago, you published a book, The Case for Israel, and shortly after, 2 years later, a book, The Case for Peace. Would writing any of these books be more difficult today?
Very much more difficult today. The case for Israel is much harder to make today with young people, particularly, who have been propagandized into believing that Israel is a colonial, settler, apartheid, genocidal state. I would have to be a better advocate than I was back in the day. Also, the case for peace is a little bit more difficult to write in light of Hamas, in light of October 7th. I still aspire to Palestinian independence and Palestinian statehood by a neighbor that's peaceful and has rejected terrorism, but that can't be done as long as Hamas is in control of large areas of what would be part of a Palestinian state. So, of course, everything I have written in my life, my 54 books, are always works in progress. And I always would revise anything I wrote, no matter what it was. But particularly when it comes to Israel, it's always a developing story. I learned that, interestingly enough, very much from Amnon Rubinstein, who I met almost 55 years ago. And I remember talked then about how important it is to understand the need for change, the need for adaptation, to get mathematical, the need for Bayesian analysis, always changing what you say and what you do in light of changing circumstances. So even though I'm 85 years old, I'm in the process of changing many of my ideas and thoughts, although the fundamental ones, the fundamental theory of Zionism, defense of Israel, defense of civil liberties, the importance of constitutional law has remained the same since the day I met Amnon many years ago.
What about the Israeli government? Do you not think there are ways in which statements and actions by the government are making the case more difficult to push through the younger generation?
Without a doubt. But I think the problem would be similar. Yes, you get people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who play into the narrative of fascism, and it's not necessarily true, but it plays into that narrative. And there are many problems, but the Israeli government has one job, and that is to defend the citizens of Israel. It shouldn't be as concerned about public opinion as say, the Jewish community in America is concerned about public opinion. Israel's job is to destroy Hamas, to make sure Hezbollah doesn't have the ability to keep Israelis out of their homes in northern Israel, to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear arsenal. Those are Israel's primary responsibilities. The primary responsibilities of the galut, of the diaspora, is to support Israel and make its case. There's a lot more Israel could do, but Israel is a deeply divided country. It's a democracy. I remember having dinner with Bill Clinton once when he was president, and he said, the problem with Israel is it's a democracy, damn it. He said, when I want to get the Jordanians to do something, I just call them. It's done. The Egyptians, done. The Saudis, done. But when I call Israel, well, I have to talk to the big cabinet, the small cabinet, the war cabinet, the Knesset. I have to do public opinion polls. I have to, a democracy is divided. The Jewish people are divided. Israel is divided. And it's very hard to have a hasbara which is successful. I have a plan. I've had a plan for years, but nobody in Israel wants to listen. That is public relations. Hasbara has to be taken out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It has to be placed in the office of the president. The president of Israel is the only uniting force in Israel today. And the president's office should be in charge of all hasbara, and it shouldn't represent the views of a particular government. It should represent the views of Israel as such, the people of Israel, Am Yisrael, and that's not what's happening today. So even the hasbara is divided and ineffective.
Let's move our focus a bit into Israel and rely on your constitutional expertise. You know, war is never good news for democracy. And we know this very well from the history of the United States and its Supreme Court and its constitutional cases. We've seen in the last few months the police clamp down on protesters. We've seen the Minister of Communication, Kari, shut down one news outlet and confiscate equipment from Associated Press and others for business they were doing with Al Jazeera. From following the news from Israel, how well do you think the government is navigating between its national security concerns and obligations or commitment to democracy?
I'll go back to being a professor. I would give it a B- with grade inflation, not a good grade. But the United States got a D when it confined 110,000 American citizens of Japanese ancestry in camps, when it shut down dissent, and McCarthyism came shortly after the Second World War. So as you say, constitutional rights are the first victims of war, but ultimately war can produce democracy. The Second World War helped produce democracy, not only in the United States, but in Germany and in Japan. And so if Israel manages to destroy and defeat Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, control Iran at least, it could help promote democracy throughout the Middle East. A peace with the Saudis might help promote democracy in Saudi Arabia. So I see a big difference between short-term, middle-term, and long-term goals. The long-term goal of Israel is to promote democracy and to create more independence on the part of peaceful Palestinians. Let's remember, too, people tend to ignore the fact that there already is a Palestinian state. It's called Ramallah. If you go to Ramallah, as I have on numerous occasions, and you meet with the prime minister, the president of the Palestinian Authority, you see the beginnings of a potential peaceful Palestinian state, not always peaceful. The people of Ramallah lynched 2 Israeli soldiers and murdered them some years ago. But in general, what you never see an Israeli soldier, you never see an occupation, you never see Israeli police, you rarely see Israeli tourists. You see a city which votes for its own people, takes out its own garbage, makes its own economic decisions. That could be a model for extending independence and gradually moving towards something that resembles a disarmed state, which could be democratic. The problem is today, if you allow the Palestinians democracy, you know they will vote for Hamas. The polls show that overwhelmingly. So you have a conflict between democratic means on the one hand, votes, and democratic ends, the same thing that happened in Germany in 1933. In both instances, just the plurality voted for Nazis, Hamas, but more than any other party. And so there's a lot of work to do, not only on the part of Israel to promote democracy, but more importantly on the part of the Palestinians.
As you know, up to October 6th, Israel was embroiled in this debate over plans for a judicial overhaul. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you expressed your opinion that those plans had some merit, but also you also criticized components of it that you saw as weakening the Supreme Court. Jumping forward to today, do you think the plans to weaken the Supreme Court and the way they were perceived in the international community had to do with the process in the ICC and in other international tribunals who maybe see Israel today as less fit, or its judicial system as less fit to fairly investigate allegations of war crimes and other wrongdoings?
Absolutely not. First of all, the hypocrisy of the international community. I was against most of the judicial reforms, but if every one of the judicial reforms had been enacted, Israel's Supreme Court would be more like the United States Supreme Court, more like the British, the French, the German Supreme Courts. The Israel Supreme Court was the most powerful judicial institution in the history of the world. There had never been a more powerful judicial institution. I was opposed to pulling back on them. I thought it was a big mistake for the Netanyahu administration to push forward with such a controversial plan without planning, without work So I was against most of the judicial reforms, although I think some judicial reforms are appropriate. Those are more appropriate for debates among academics than for street demonstrations. But it was a terrible miscalculation to divide Israel about an issue that wasn't really essential to the day-to-day concerns of everyday Israelis. Important to be sure, but no, I don't think it will affect the decisions of the ICC, the ICJ. They shouldn't. The Israeli Supreme Court, even if it's weakened, is a much, much more independent court than almost any court in Europe and almost any court in the Americas. So unless a double standard is applied, the issue of complementarity would preclude the ICC from investigating Israel as long as Israel conducts its own valid investigations of the issues that the ICC claims justify a warrant. They do not justify a warrant under the treaty. And of course, the ICJ's allegations of genocide are completely made up. There's no basis for them at all. They're not looking into Syria. They're not looking into Iran. They're not looking into some of the African countries. It's a single standard of injustice that the ICJ and increasingly the ICC are trying to impose on Israel. And Israel has to fight back by every means, legal means, political means, diplomatic means.
But if you were to advise to the Israeli government on how to meet the expectations that would satisfy the criteria of complementarity, what would your advice be?
Very simple. Just open a domestic investigation of some kind. It could be through a commission of the kind that Israel has done many, many times. It could be through decisions made by the state attorney or by the attorney general. Israel has many capabilities, legal, to investigate any allegations of war crimes. And under the Rome Treaty, of which Israel is not a signatory and doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of the court, nonetheless, it's entitled to the benefits of complementarity. And complementarity has been employed by the ICC in many instances involving countries that have a far, far less independent judiciary than Israel. So Israel should move forward with its own investigation, should immediately notify the ICC that it is conducting its own investigation and that it's therefore inadmissible, that's the word used under the treaty, inadmissible for the ICC to further investigate as long as Israel is doing a proper and appropriate investigation.
Thank you very much. Toda rabba, Professor Dershowitz.
Bakasha.